Hello everyone, and welcome to the 28th Objective-C tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can use key value observing in Objective-C. So, key value observing is basically the counterpart to key value coding, which we've been learning about in the last tutorial, where key value coding you can set different values by just knowing its property name, but key value observing is kind of the opposite of that, where you can observe some other value and then you can kind of respond accordingly. So in our example here, we're going to have a person and a dog class, and basically the dog is just going to have some int of a hunger level. So whenever that hunger level changes, our person will be notified of that change, and then it can act or do whatever it wants. So key value observing is extremely powerful, and it's used all throughout Cocoa in combination of key value coding. So key value coding and key value observing, really key concepts when you're working with Cocoa. So it's good to understand how they work. So anyway, with that said, let's just cover what we want to with this. So we have our two classes. We have our person, and our person is literally just a subclass of NSObject. It has nothing, and you don't even really need this dialog method. But we'll be changing this later on. But again, person for right now is just a normal NS object, basically. So that said, let's move on to the dog, where we actually have something interesting. And the dog has just an int of hunger, and of course it has a property, and it also synthesizes those methods as well. So hunger, property, and we're synthesizing the methods, so we can have accessors and setters, or getters and setters. And basically our hunger is going to be set to a value of 1 in our init method. So that's really all we have for the two classes. Pretty basic, take you a few seconds to set up. Anyway, once you have those things set up, we can go into our main.m, make sure you're importing the two objects, and that's all we want to do. So go ahead and create your new objects now. So we have person, we'll just call it me, and typing on the wrong line. Let's just say person. Wow, I'm goofing it. Alloc init, there we go. And now we of course want to create a dog, so we can say dog, alloc init. And now, before I forget, like I do for all these tutorials, is we want to say me release, and we also want to say dog release. So that just takes care of memory management for when we're done with these objects, and that's that. So now let's get on to the actual fun part with key value observing. So the idea of key value observing is that our person object, or any object, I guess you could, this is for everything, not just dogs and people. So basically our person object, though, is going to be observing the dog's hunger level. So anytime the dog's hunger level changes, our person will be notified of this change. So basically we use one method to add ourselves as an observer. It's kind of a long one, but it's fairly descriptive and straightforward. So what it is we just say dog, and then we say add observer for KeyPath, options, context. So it's kind of a long method, but it's fairly informative of what we actually have to plug into this. So we have dog, and we're adding an observer. So basically, like I said before, me, or the person object, is going to be the observer of the dog's value. So of course, if we're adding an observer to our dog, that observer is going to be us. So we can just say me as our object. So now the value that we're going to be observing is the hunger. So we can just pass in as a key path of hunger. And again, this goes with the key value coding. Basically our key path in this case is just our property name, and that's what we're analyzing, any changes that happen to our hunger via the accessors. So let's just recover what we just did. We have our dog, we're adding ourselves as an observer to the dog, and then we're saying that we're going to be observing this, basically our hunger object, or our int hunger, and the key path of course is just hunger for that. So let's just skip over to here. Context, we just want to plug in as null because we don't really use context, so just leave it as null, and that's just kind of a C thing with pointers. So null just means it's basically nothing, so it's a null pointer. It's not pointing to anything. So context, we're just leaving alone basically for this. So options now is where things get a little different anyway. And basically what this allows us to do is change what kind of options we're taking in, or what kind of values, or sorry, I should say when we're actually observing the values. So let me just write this out instead of babbling on about it. So what we want to say is NSKey value observing option new. And there's a few other options for this, of course. The other one is, well, there's a few other that I'm not covering even with this, but another option is option old. And basically what this means is that when we're observing this value, the value that's going to be, or when this is going to be updated, is whenever there's a new value towards it. So whenever the value is finally set, that's the value that we're going to be receiving as our observer. So whenever the value is finally set, we're going to be receiving the new value. If we said NSKey value observing option old, then we would be receiving the old value before it was set. So you can see this basically just specifies when we're going to be or when this is going to be sent to us as the observer. So there's one other important thing about this, though, is that when we go to receive these objects, this will also determine what is actually passed in. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we actually get towards plugging this in our person class. But basically, it will actually pass the value in an NS dictionary, and then we can actually use the values out of that dictionary. Kind of confusing right now, but we'll get into more of that. So just remember, this is basically when the value is going to be passed on. If we say option old, it's just going to be the old option that's passed on, or the value before hunger was changed. And if we just say option new, it's going to be the new value. So another thing that we have to do if we're observing anything is when we are done with our objects, we have to make sure that we are getting rid of ourselves, or we're removing ourselves, I should say, as an observer. So we never want to just release ourselves before saying we don't want to observe anymore. Because what's going to happen is, if, let's say, we just get rid of ourselves, we get rid of our person object, and we decide to set our dog's value, but we didn't remove ourselves as an observer, this is going to be causing major problems, because dog is going to be trying to send these updates to us, but we're not going to be existing. We're gone because we said something like me release. So we have to make sure before we actually release our objects or get rid of ourselves, we have to make sure that we are removing ourselves as an observer. We don't want to be observing the value anymore. So to do this, it's pretty simple. All we have to say is dog remove observer, and of course the observer is me for the KeyPath hunger. So this is just a crucial step before you remove yourself from the program or any running application. Make sure that you remove yourself as an observer, because if you don't, then you're going to be causing major problems if the dog's hunger value ever changes when you're not there. So again, just make sure that you're removing yourself as an observer before you say something like me release. So anyway, that's just two things that you have to know about key value observing right now. We're adding ourselves as observers, and you have to remove yourself as an observer. So that's that. And the last key important part, of course, is what happens when we get an update for this. So basically, if our dog is setting a new value, so we say dog set hunger to something else, well, our person object is going to, or in this case me, is going to be updated of this change. And we have to have a way of changing, or we have to have a way of responding to these updates. So we don't want to just be an observer and not do anything if the change happens, because there's no point to observing something if you don't care about the outcome. So what key value observing allows us to do is, when the hunger value is changed, since we're an observer of this value, whenever this value is changed, a message is going to be sent to us saying, hey, we changed this value, do something with it. So what we have to implement in our person, because we're the observers, so we're going to be getting sent the message or all the notifications basically. So what we want to say is we want to say void, and we just say observe value for key path, and there's a bunch of other things here which we'll talk about. Okay, so observe value for key path of object change context. That's the entire method that we have, or that we have to work with here. So basically, like I said before, whenever the dog's hunger value is changed, this is going to be sent to us because we are an observer. So basically, we just want to have a way of responding to this. So let's just cover a few of these things here, what are actually going to be passed to us when this method is called. So when the message is sent to the person to say, hey, respond to this, all the things that are going to be passed in. The key path is just the basically the key path that we're observing. So in our case, it's going to be hunger for this tutorial. But again, remember, we can observe multiple objects, so it could be anything that we're observing. And then the object, of course, is the object we are observing. So in that case, it's the dog. And the change is very interesting because the change is it actually passes in the values that are changed. So remember when I said that right here we were talking about NS key value observing option new. This is what's going to be passed in our NS dictionary, is either the old value or the new value depending on what we said we wanted to observe. So in our case we said we wanted to observe the new values. So in our NS dictionary, the change, there's going to be a object in there that will have the new value that we set it to. So what we can do is basically say, let's just imagine we have a bunch of key paths. So we can say if key path is equal to string, and we'll just say if it's equal to the string hunger, because that's the property, or I should say the key path that we're observing. So if the key path is equal to the string hunger, so basically if we get sent this message and what we're actually being sent from, if it's being sent from the hunger, or the hunger update basically, then we want to be able to update according to the hunger. So that was kind of confusing, but let me just reword that. Basically, if our dog is sending us an update because we're the observers of the hunger value, doing key path is equal to string is going to make sure that we're just making sure that the value we are looking at here is a change from the hunger, not something else. So because we can observe multiple objects, this is why we'd like to check to make sure that this is actually the hunger string that is being called to the person, because it could be anything really. So make sure that you are checking to make sure what is being passed in. So if we are being passed in the hunger, that means that we want to be checking for the dog's hunger. So we can do this in a few ways, but we're just going to use key value coding way first off, just so that you can have a kind of know what we're talking about here. So since we know that the key path is equal to hunger, that means that the hunger value on the dog has changed. So that means that we should be able to look at our dog right now and it should have a new value. So we can say dog, and we can just say value, or not say dog, sorry, I should say object, because that's what we're passing in. Object value for key path, and the key path is our key path. So all this is going to do is it's just going to print out the value that our dog now has for our hunger. Remember, we're passing in this case, hunger. So what we're doing here is, remember, our object that's being passed in is what we're observing. So our dog, we're checking the dog's value for key path, and that key path is going to be hunger. So all this NSLog is going to do is return the value of the hunger. So it's just the new value of hunger. So let's go ahead and test this out in our little application here. Just say dog, and we want to set our hunger to be something else. So let's just say 67, and go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get 67 printed out as a new option. We can also try a few other things if we want. We can say dog set hunger, let's just call it 45, and go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get 67 and 45. So this is key value observing at work. Basically, since we're observing the hunger value, whenever a dog's hunger changes, it will notify its observer, which is us. So we will get sent this long message here, observe value for KeyPath, blah, blah, blah. And we can test to see, well, hey, if we're being sent the KeyPath of hunger, then we know that the value that we're being sent here is from the dog's hunger, basically. So we can then use key value coding if we wanted to check the value for that key path, and then we could print that out if we wanted to. But another important thing to note is that we have this change NS dictionary, which is a very crucial part. So this is actually passing in, the change dictionary is actually passing in the new value. So again, like I said, since we're saying option new for what we're trying to observe, when our dog is sending us this message to say, hey, we've updated the value, what our change dictionary is going to contain is that new value of whatever our hunger is. So what we can say is we can say change, and then we can say object for key, and this is just standard NS dictionary stuff. Object for key, and the key that we want to be looking for is NS key value change new key, and that's just, again, another kind of thing you have to remember for this. But basically, NS key value change new key, all it represents is the new value that would be in our change. So the important thing here, though, is that since we said our observer is going to be NS key value observing option new, we are getting the new value. So we're not getting the change dictionary doesn't have the old value in it, it has the new value. So the important thing to note is that we have to use NS key value change new key, and we can't use old key because we weren't observing the old value. So if we do this, again, our change dictionary is only going to contain the new value that was passed to us. So we can say change object for key NS key change new key, or NS key value change new key. And then when we go to run this, we should get the exact same output that we did before. And as you can see, we get 67 and 45. So let's change this up though a little bit just to really wrap our minds around this concept. Let's pretend that we want to observe the old value. So we want to observe the value before it gets changed. So to do this, we could just switch this to old. So now we're observing it for the old value, and basically all that we're doing for this is we want to be receiving the old value. So when we're in our person now, we don't want to get the NS key value change new key, we want to get the old key because that's what we were observing. We're observing the old key value, not the new one. So we want to say old key instead of new key. And again, the change isn't going to contain the new key value, it's only going to contain the old key, because again, if that's what we specify we're going to be observing, that's all we're going to get. So for this, we're saying NS key value change old key, and then we can print that object out. So since our dog originally started with a value of 1 in its init method, and then it changes along, we can see all the old values as they were. So we can see that the first value, the oldest value, is a value of 1, and that's because, again, we're observing all the old values. So since the oldest value is 1, that's what we're printing out. And then the value before we change it to 45 was 67, of course, so we're printing out the value of 67 because, again, that's the old value that was contained in the change NS dictionary. So that's really how key value observing works in Objective-C. It's not that hard of a concept to really understand once you use it a little bit. So, just write a few lines of code here and there, and you'll eventually understand how this works. But again, just to summarize what we've done here, key value observing is really to get one object to monitor some other object's value. So in this case, we were monitoring the dog's hunger value. We're able to observe either the old values before they are changed, or the new values before they are or after they are changed. And then whenever the dog decides to set the hunger, so it changes the hunger value, then our dog will be sending us this nice little notification right here, or this nice message, and it's going to be saying, hey, we're going to pass all this information off to you, and you can respond by whatever you want. So we're testing to make sure that what we received is the hunger key path that we were trying to observe, and then we're just printing out that value that was passed to us. So that's the main idea of key value observing, and that mix with key value coding is actually one of the biggest parts of Cocoa and what makes it very powerful, which we'll get into in some of the coming Cocoa tutorials. So anyway, I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel and click the odd ad if you're feeling nice. Alright, I'll see you in next tutorial.